This conference is now being recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Darius from New York ASBO. Welcome to the Payroll Administration webinar. Operator assistance is available anytime during this conference by pressing £. A question and answer session will follow this presentation. You may send chat questions at any time during the presentation using the chat window on your right, indicated by a speech bubble icon, which is also on the right of the presentation. This afternoon, we have with us Brian Dumond, Dennis Hill, and Trina Hapgood. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the presentation to Dennis Hill for your listening pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, as Matthew said, this is Dennis Hill. I'm one of the three presenters for today's webinar. It will be broken out into two parts. Trina and I will be handling the first part of the webinar. We will be sharing with you some areas of concern that you or your staff in the payroll area will be facing. Also, then Brian, who's a partner for Dermody, Burke & Brown, will be presenting the second half of the webinar as you look at your payroll through an auditor's perspective. Trina, just to give you a little bit of background, Trina is the payroll supervisor for the OCM BOCES, Onondaga, Cortland, Madison County BOCES Central Business Office. She handles payroll for two different districts and primarily works with finance manager. So if you have any questions maybe directly related to that software or that system, it will be targeted towards Trina. I am the OCM BOCES payroll supervisor. We process pay for roughly 1,100 employees, and we currently are using the WinCap system. So if you have any questions in regards to WinCap, hopefully I can help you on that. Today's webinar should be about an hour and a half long, and hopefully if we planned it correctly, there should be time for questions through the chat room as we go through the webinar or at the end if we have time for it. If not, I'm sure we'll make concessions to getting those questions answered. It's hard to know what everyone will want to get out of this webinar. Some may be just looking for their CPA credits, and others may be looking at ways to identify potential risks and improve their processes within their departments. Trina and I are not business officials, so we can't sit here and tell you specifically what each of you will need to make you succeed in your jobs. But what we can tell you and hopefully show you is an understanding of what may be going on in your payroll departments and how this may impact you as a school business official. That is essentially our goal for today. We want you to have an open mind and take a different look at your payroll staff and processes. We want you to understand the challenges that your staff may be facing on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. For example, many of you may have not known, September may not be the best time to do a payroll webinar. As we're finding, it's a very difficult time as the school year rolls around, but hopefully we'll make our way through this and you'll be able to take something with you of value and learn something today. Now, how do we go about achieving the goals that we've laid out for today? Throughout this presentation, we're going to be building a diagram, and the diagram will be identifying key functions, processes, areas within your department where your staff may be experiencing their most challenges. We will be discussing the cyclical and functional challenges of these areas. In the center of the diagram, you will notice the topic of the payroll schedule. Your district's payroll schedule is essentially the central point of your department. Payroll schedule has a direct link to the challenges of each area, which we will be discussing today. It will help to develop how the processes are set up and helps to determine the deadlines for the department. We are going to highlight many of these relationships. We're not saying that the payroll schedule drives everything that is done in the payroll department, just that it has a direct relationship to the functions that are being performed. I tend to be a quick speaker. If I'm going too fast speaking, please just throw out a chat to slow down. The topics that we are going to be focusing on today for this part one are your school calendars, the payroll cycle, timesheets and overtime, deductions, external reporting, and planning and cash flow issues. Some of these areas you are very familiar with within your own schools, so we'll be covering them very briefly, while others may spark and generate some additional discussions. Please feel free at any time to type in the question or comment, and this end will make sure that we can get that addressed. If you're not sure of something or you want further clarification, please don't hesitate to let us know that you'd like to discuss this a little bit more. And hopefully we'll have some examples or some ways to solve the questions that you might have. This is just a sampling of the diagram that we're going to build. We're primarily focusing on the payroll schedule, its impact on several payroll topics, and the challenges it will create for your staff and ultimately you. The subject will become the center of our part one of our webinar. The payroll schedule is essentially the pay dates your employees will be receiving their paychecks. This schedule is established in conjunction with your personnel department, administration, and becomes a central focal point to many processes and functions performed within the payroll department. The dates on the schedule are determined by the frequency of your pays, and hopefully you will also be reviewing the impact of the payroll schedule challenges that we'll be discussing next before you establish your payroll schedule. Determining the schedule is not always as easy or simple as let's use the same pay dates that we did last year. Each year you should be looking at the schedule and figuring out how to minimize the salary risk. How do we account for a calendar creep? Do we really know what the calendar creep is, and does it even apply to us? What happens if we want to switch from one frequency and schedule to another one? Do we know the right terminology, and does the organization know how to communicate the proper verbiage to the employees? What do our employees want when it comes to the schedule, or do we really care? How does our collective bargaining contracts impact our payroll schedules? These are all things that you should be looking at. We're going to discuss each one in a little bit more detail, but just want to throw out those questions of what you should be considering before your payroll schedule is created. When we try to minimize our salary risk, how do we minimize the risk, or is there anything that we can do to eliminate the risk of prepayment? I don't think it is possible to completely eliminate this risk unless you want to make all your employees fill out timesheets so that they've accounted for all the time that they've worked once it's happened, and then you won't have any prepayment issues. Of course, by filling out timesheets, you will have other challenges which we are going to talk about later in this presentation under the timesheet section. Do you like to hold back salary? Some districts will hold back salary for 5 days as a way of minimizing their prepayment risk. Whether it's 5 days, 2 weeks, holding back creates its own issues when you don't pay your employees or new employees timely. Plus, you have to remember at the end when they leave how many days were held back and process that at that time. We want to say that the biggest way to minimize your salary risk is to foster the communication between your HR, human resources, payroll staff, and the rest of the organization. Do your supervisors or managers understand the importance of communicating change, and how quickly do they communicate to personnel or payroll when an employee resigns, quits, or retires? I know from our own experiences, we minimize our most risk when we have supervisors that contact us directly when one of those actions happens, as opposed to, oh, so-and-so has been out on maternity for 2 months and we just found out because they're calling to sign the baby up for health insurance. Discussing payroll or calendar creep. What is payroll or calendar creep? Well, anyone that pays on a weekly or biweekly basis has had to deal with the calendar creep. So let's give you an example that your fiscal year runs from July to June and you pay on a biweekly basis. So you would have 26 pay periods that cover 10 days each, that you're accounting for 260 out of the 261 work days in the calendar year. So in that regards, with that calculation, you're basically losing 1 day a year for each year that you pay under that biweekly system. That pushes your first payroll date to closer to July 1st, which creates a larger prepayment issue. Eventually, you will have to address this issue. Are you making their employees go 3 weeks every 5 years between their last paycheck in June and their first pay in July? If you do this, we seriously recommend that you have some form of communication in place where you give your employees months in advance so that they will have time to adjust for the change. Most employees may not be happy that they're having to go 3 weeks, but they can understand as long as they're communicated with. Maybe you're a district that splits your pay and you'll do partial checks. So you do a couple days at the beginning of July and you do the rest of the pay in June. That's a way of minimizing your risk. The downside to that is extra payroll processing. Sometimes the partial pays, cause whether it's a new employee or even existing employees to have less salary during a particular couple-week pay period than they're used to having. The splitting the pays and the partial pays will have a direct effect on your payroll cycle and also your retirement reporting, which we will be discussing later. We want to suggest that when you create your payroll schedule, if you're going to have any gaps or breaks that are different from the normal, whether it's biweekly, weekly, that you highlight those so that all employees are aware of those gaps, and that'll save you a lot of trouble in the end. If you've ever thought about transitioning from one payroll schedule to another, have you ever wondered if it would be possible to switch the payroll schedules? Well, I have firsthand knowledge of this as we are currently transitioning from a biweekly to a semi-monthly payroll schedule. It was something that we never thought we'd be able to do. We know the benefits of a semi-monthly payroll schedule, but we thought it would be next to impossible to go from the last pay in June all the way to July 15th. So we've worked out a process in our payroll schedule to be able to do that. It essentially has been a 3-year process to transition that, so it's possible. It may not always be possible immediately from one fiscal year to the next, but sometimes you have to transition through that. You wouldn't think that changing an employee's pay date by a couple of days each pay period would be so hard, but it was quite the undertaking and could be its own separate webinar. One of the biggest issues you will deal with a new payroll schedule is the treatment of your weekends and holidays. Every employee is a little bit different. The banks account for things a little bit differently, so you want to make sure that you're conscious of the fact that if you want to pay on the 15th and the 30th, how are you going to treat those weekend days when that day falls on one of those, or the payday falls on one of those days? One other thing to consider is if you switch your pay periods is certain things like retirement reporting. If you normally pay on the 30th of the month, and you pay a Sunday on a Monday, and the Sunday is the 30th, can you pay on Monday, December 1st? And the answer you should know is no, that your payroll, you need to provide your employees with 2 pays a month for the retirement system reporting if that's what the retirement systems are expecting. If you're normally 2 pays a month, you can't change your date to the next day in December. You have to make sure that they get their 20 days of credit and their 2 pays per month. How are you communicating your payroll schedule with your employees? Are you putting them into a note? Are you putting them in the paychecks? I would make sure that the communication is open and that you're providing ample communication in your payroll schedule to all your employees. You should also, as a recommendation, be putting your pay frequency days on your payroll schedule. And by pay frequency, I mean what this pay period is covered, what pay dates are covering this particular pay date. So if you have a July 15th pay date, you want to make sure that the employees know that this salary payment is being covered for July 1st to July 15th or whatever it is, so that they have an idea of when they're being paid and what days they're being paid for. Your verbiage is very, very important. You want to consistently communicate to the staff, whether you're paying bi-monthly or as opposed to a semi-monthly. A lot of times you might have the risk there where a new employee is being told that they're being paid bi-monthly because you just came off of a bi-weekly payroll, and they may think they're getting paid every other month. So they may not raise that question. They may take another job as a result of that. So you want to make sure that everyone in the organization, especially the people in your payroll department and your personnel department, whoever is communicating what type of pay schedule you have, is using the proper verbiage. With contractual issues, there may be language within your employee contracts that identify the payroll schedule within your organization and what the organization has to use. Do you have that flexibility to change the schedule in your current contract language, or do you have to wait until the next negotiation? You might want to even figure out if this is a negotiable item. Most things are, but sometimes people feel that the school district has the right to change that payroll schedule, and other people feel that it's going to be a negotiable item. So next, Trina's going to be talking about school calendars a little bit.
Hello. If you notice, we put in North Syracuse Central School, not to pick on them, but we wanted to include a copy of a school calendar. Most of you will know that it's going to identify your breaks and your holidays. It must be reviewed to ensure it is accurate and valid when compared to the school calendar. The school board will adopt the calendar, and obviously there's no less than 180 days per year. I'm here to talk about the challenges of the payroll department when it comes to the school calendar. The first one is distribution of the paychecks during holidays and school breaks. I currently do payroll for 2 districts, and I oversee a 3rd district. And the lack of consistency or common practice between each district is amazing. I have one district that would move the payday. For instance, the district has Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday off for Thanksgiving. They're moving the payday till Tuesday, up from Friday, so that their employees can have their paycheck in their hand before they leave for their break. I have another district that leaves the payday right on Friday. They will either mail it Wednesday evening, or hopefully distribution to the mailboxes of the payroll or to the employees on Friday, or maybe even Saturday. So it's really just a challenge. You have to know what you're going to do with those paychecks if the employees aren't there to pick them up in the normal fashion. Another challenge is the coordination of the calendars with other districts in BOCES. For instance, all 3 of the districts that I oversee use the CNY RIC to print the paychecks. Well, if the RIC is closed, they can't print our paychecks, and that's a big problem, because if the paycheck is in, we don't get the paychecks, the employee don't get the paychecks, and that could be a big problem. We also use the BOCES courier system. So if, for instance, our district is open, but BOCES isn't, how are we going to get mail back and forth, which could include those paychecks? When I was hired initially 7 years ago to do payroll, in my interview, it was laid out that before I ever wanted to take a vacation, I had to look at the school calendar and or my payroll schedule, because unfortunately, I can't schedule a vacation day if I have to process a payroll. That is going to transfer right into snow days and unscheduled days off. If I have a snow day, no matter how bad it is, and I have to process a payroll or send direct deposit file, I have to make it to the school to do that. Unfortunately, at this point in time, I can't work remotely. I'm trying, but they keep telling me no. So on snow days or unscheduled days off, I go to work if I have to. It is presented in the one district that I work for. On a snow day, paychecks are available between 9 and noon. That means I have to be in my office between 9 and noon to hand out those paychecks. It's at this point in time I hand them a paycheck and a direct deposit authorization form, because that would make everyone's life easier on snow days. So I'm going to turn to Dennis. That's all I have on school calendars. If anyone had any questions, please just send them in.
Next, we're going to be talking about your payroll cycles and the challenges you may be facing within the payroll cycle. Essentially, the payroll cycle is the length of time between each of your payrolls. The payroll cycle is the one area that we will be discussing today that is most directly influenced by the payroll schedule within your district. The functions of the payroll cycle involve collecting the timesheets, calculating the proper pay, inputting the hours, updating the deductions, posting payroll, printing checks, and the delivery of the checks. You may think sometimes certain payroll schedules are easier. The payroll schedule of a biweekly system is probably easier to calculate because each of the functions can be tied to a particular date, whereas a semi-monthly payroll maybe a little bit more difficult to understand the payroll cycle because each day of the week may be a different payday, and you may have to adjust your payroll schedule and cycle according to that. If you're discussing whether you want to go to a new payroll cycle, what we would suggest is looking at the new paydays that you're looking at and working backwards from those paydays to make sure that your payroll cycle accounts for everything that needs to be done to maximize your time restraints and provide employees with the reasonable deadlines. The communication of your payroll cycle to other key staff is important to ensure that certain dates are met within the cycle. Personnel will need to know which dates the payroll is being posted and to know when their changes need to be in by, and the treasurer will need to know which days the payroll transfer is necessary to have the funds available to the bank. You want to look to make sure, is your staff allowing enough time in the payroll cycle to ensure that certain best practices are being performed? Are you balancing your payrolls, reviewing change reports, verifying proper sign-offs, etc.? Brian's going to be touching on the best practices a little bit more in his portion of the webinar. So what are some of the challenges of the payroll cycle? Are you doing partial checks, and are you addressing the calendar creep in that particular cycle? Have you made the necessary modifications to address for more or less days within that cycle? Has the communication of the change in the payroll cycle been done to all employees, and especially those who will be sending in timesheets and other pertinent information? You want to talk about how do we handle unique circumstances. If you prepay an employee, for example, if you're prepaying your employees and you heard through the grapevine that someone is quitting or has quit, and you can't get an answer from a supervisor, how would you hold that person's check? Or worse yet, if you're offering direct deposit, would you stop that direct deposit, issue a check, and hold it? You want to make sure that you're handling those unique circumstances and situations consistently. Sometimes you're not sure exactly, when the situation comes up, everything seems to have to be handled in its own unique situation, but you want to just make sure that you're handling consistency. We also recommend that someone in payroll is reviewing the minutes from the monthly board meetings to provide a double check for personnel issues that may be going on within the organization. Are you offering direct deposit? It may be a goal of yours to have 100% employee participation with direct deposit, but there are some real challenges with direct deposit as well. Typically, the direct deposit file must be submitted to the bank a day or two before the payday. So you can't always, once that file is sent, the money is gone. It's very difficult to get that money back if an employee has left. Do you only have one person that's doing your payroll? If so, then you've probably already looked at the challenge of allowing employees to take vacations while reviewing that payroll cycle. So we want you just to be aware that, sometimes you need to have the backups in place for your internal staff so that all employees are eligible and can take vacations. There may be certain times of year when vacations aren't allowed. Typically for us in the summertime, our workload actually increases here, so most of the time vacation is typically not allowed for us or approved in the summertime.
Within your payroll cycle is going to be when you're going to collect your timesheets for regular employees and overtime. It amazes me how many timesheets I get that have blank spots. I don't create the timesheets with lines just to make them look pretty. And employees sometimes just don't understand that, and supervisors will sign timesheets without appropriate signatures and information on them. They obviously need dates, times, descriptions, and all those signatures. The overtime will get paid for certain employees who work over 40 hours per week. If you're a semi-monthly payroll processor, this does not change that requirement. And Section 162 of the New York State Labor Law provides that employees who work more than 6 hours in a shift be provided with a 30-minute meal period. And once again, we're going to go with the challenges. The accuracy of a calculated time work, this is crazy. It's just general math. It's amazing how many times people will put on a timesheet that 1 to 4 is 5 hours. It's just general math. You would be amazed to know how many errors we catch. Overtime calculation for semi-monthly payrolls are employees with multiple jobs. For instance, one of my districts that I just did, I did their payroll, and they had one bus driver that had 7 different pay rates and 7 different budget codes. Trying to figure it out for the first time, because it's a new district, I was pulling my hair out yesterday, saying to myself, why am I doing this job? Unfortunately, from the bus drivers, I went to food service, and they're pretty cut and dry. Vacation days and holidays can throw off overtime. I have one district that does not pay overtime if there is a holiday. They would get their straight time. I have another district, depending on which bargaining unit, it's in their contractual language that a vacation date is not going to affect their overtime rate. So again, it's the lack of consistency, not only within districts, but within the bargaining units inside those districts. We mentioned earlier that you have to identify lunch periods. On timesheets, it's very understand whether people are saying their 8 to 4 shift included their lunch hour, didn't have lunch hour. So that's an issue when you create the timesheets. One thing to think of is maybe a time in, a time out from lunch, a time back from lunch, and then a time out. Again, the accuracy of the completed timesheets, as Dennis is going to attest to, signatures are important. Signatures prove that the supervisors have looked over those timesheets, and yes, that person was actually entitled to be there working, and yes, he's actually entitled to that pay. Late timesheets, those timesheets that are consistently late during our payroll cycle, do we have a process in place? I can say I know there's one supervisor that will always be late with his timesheets. And do I always send him an email and a phone call on the day the timesheets are due? Yes. Do I usually get them? Yes. I have had another district that has, can we say, challenged their supervisor to tell him that if his employee's timesheets are submitted late, his check will be held up, not the employee's check. Could we legally do it? No, but did the threat work? Yes. He's very rarely late anymore. Applying current procedures for contract changes. Contract changes can create all sorts of new procedures and processes for the payroll department. So when you're doing your contract negotiations, you might think, well, one more day off or let's shorten their day is no big deal, but that can change your whole process of payroll, and it can also change your whole computer program. You know, all of the hours that these employees work and are in that program to be tracked. We just had a question come in about what if timesheets are not turned in. And the answer to that is if it's a salary that just turned in a timesheet to prove they worked, I would go ahead and pay them. If it was an hourly employee that didn't turn their timesheet in, and I knew I was expecting one, I would try and track that timesheet down. If it got down to my drop dead date and my time to transfer my direct deposit and such and print my checks and I didn't have that timesheet, unfortunately that person would not be paid. Would I turn around and cut a separate check if it came in? I could honestly probably say yes, because I am a customer service person and the employees are my customers.
One of the things you want to consider with that too is not necessarily whose fault, but what was the determination for why the timesheet was late. Do you have a policy in place where you don't want to penalize your employees because it sat on a supervisor's desk, you know, for a week, and that employee signed it at a particular time and got it to his supervisor, so that was the holdup. Was it the employee just forgot, didn't care, it was extra money to him, and just did it when someone finally told him to do it? So you want to make sure that you're not penalizing your employees because of a supervisor's issue, unless you're going to start holding back supervisor pay.
And one point I should probably clarify is I am not the end-all decision maker in the payroll department. I would not cut a special check without asking my school business official if it was okay to cut that special check. And again, I would make sure the timesheet was accurate and all the signatures were there.
From an auditor's perspective, when you start doing special checks or special payroll runs, that usually puts our antennas up, because essentially you're going out of your standard business practices where all the policies, procedures, and controls are in place. So at each district, you want to make sure that there's a standard procedure in place with the proper approvals and processes if you do a special pay run or a special check. Because essentially the auditors will focus right in on that. That would be considered a higher risk area.
Thanks, Dennis. We're going to move right into deductions, and we're going to send it back to Dennis.
we all know what deductions come out of our paycheck. The payroll schedule that you use for your district will drive the withholding and the recording of these deductions as far as per pay amounts and when things need to be reported. What we're going to do quickly is just talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you're going to face. A lot of times if you run summer school programs, you have those situations where you have a regular teacher that has a per pay amount coming out of their check, whether it's for direct deposits or their 403Bs, and then they start working summer school and they're not making as much. You have to have a policy or procedure in place where hopefully you're either not taking those and they know that, or you are taking them and everyone knows what the impact of that will be. Because sometimes, especially with direct deposits, I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but that becomes a tricky situation with per pay amounts and those deductions. Sometimes there's time delays in some of the stop words that you'll be getting for garnishes. Inevitably, you're going to have an employee that just walked out of the court saying the judge released their child support and they want you to change their payroll this week. So you want to make sure that you're obviously being compassionate to the employee that these situations are occurring, but at the same time having them understand that you have process and procedures in place, that you can't make a change like that without authorization from the courts to do that. So. Health and dental issues that you will have. One thing quickly on that is, when is your open enrollment? Was there any thought that when you had the open enrollment date was set to the impact that it would have on an employee's paycheck? Most districts have their employees prepaying for the summer months by the end of June. So if you have an open enrollment date that is later in the year, like March or April, this may create a financial hardship on some employees when their deductions are recalculated, especially if they're moving like from an individual to a family membership or just jumping on a family membership, because they have to make up those 2 summer months with only a limited number of pays. One big thing to be concerned with is limits, fiscal year versus calendar year. You should really be aware that there are limits. Some of them are more important than others, especially like a 403B limit that you'll be getting from your third-party administrators. Your payroll person shouldn't pay extra attention to these limits, because what could happen is if they set the limit incorrectly and an employee has too much taken out, they could be getting a 1099, a check back, and potentially penalties and fees from the IRS because they had too much withheld. So, and if it's not returned to them in a proper time, then they could be penalized for that. Sometimes you're going to have some payroll tax issues. It's not a major thing, but we just want you to be aware that it varies among each employee. The employee signing off on their W-4s, so we basically take that at their word. Sometimes people want, more taken out. Sometimes people don't want anything taken out. So everyone's situation is unique, and only if you hear from the IRS or the government that you have to take a certain withholding should you be adjusting the person's W-4 for that. That's basically it. What we're going to do is move on to,
I've got some questions in the question and answer about some timesheet issues. Astrid's asking if the 30-minute meal can be unpaid. It absolutely can be unpaid. You would have to look at your bargaining unit agreements on that. It says, what district best practices are used for late timesheets? I think we kind of went over that. If you need more detail or have more questions on that, if you can be more specific in your question, we can answer you. And then we've got another question that says, can the 30-minute unpaid time be subtracted from, for instance, a timesheet for 8 hours of overtime? I can't answer that question. In my one district that I've done for 7 years, I would not subtract it for 8 hours of overtime. I would subtract it for a regular 8-hour shift. I don't know if Brian can enlighten us on the labor laws for that one or not.
No, I'm not an attorney, and I don't play one on TV, and I haven't stayed at a Holiday Inn Express, so I'm out all three there. But I think your answer probably is a practical answer. I don't know if it's a legal answer, though. Okay.
I know ultimately there is a time limit, whether it's 10 hours or something, that you have to provide them with another meal period. However, I think what it comes down to in the end is if they were asked to work through a time, you can't just deduct a lunch period if they were asked to work. If somebody just volunteers to work through their time, that's one thing. But if their supervisors are asking them to work, they must be paid for the time that they were working.
We also have a question about what is considered late on a timesheet. Well, my pay week runs from Thursdays to Wednesday, so late timesheets for me would be the next Thursday morning. If I don't have them, they're considered late. We also have another question from Carlene that says, we are currently on Finance Manager but plan to move to WinCat. Have any of you developed a deduction cheat sheet to explain to employees what each code means?
We have not, and we don't have the deduction cheat sheet. I know some districts, my wife works for a district, and they get a summary basically in their first check about what, each deduction is and when and how many times it'll be coming out.
I do have a cheat sheet for Finance Manager. Do I make it accessible to the employees? No. If they call and ask me what a curve code means, I would absolutely make it accessible to them. If you wanted a copy of my cheat sheet, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I think you could probably get my contact information right through ASBO.
We also were told that we can work with New York State ASBO office to get some answers of the legal questions that you're talking about with the unpaid lunch periods and when things need to be paid for and what sort of time you can pay up through. We're going to move on now to talk about external reporting requirements. We've provided a slide here that basically runs through some of the types of external reporting that your staff will do. We're not going to get into any detail on this because you have it here. We've also provided you with certain due dates that you can take and use as your guidance to know when something may be due, if you want to check with your payroll person and make sure that they're adhering to that, and also provide any penalties that may be as a result of not filing those reports. Operational basically means that you're going to be hounded until that information comes to that reporting agency. So one thing I will point out really quickly that's new in 2010 is the post-retirement report that all districts have to do. It says ERS post-retirement reporting, but that's only because it's done through the ERS website. But basically anybody that retired from any of the New York State systems, if they've retired and come back to work for your district, you have to report the salary information for them for each year that they're working for you once they're retired. The last thing that we're going to talk about is planning and cash flow. And we're not going to be discussing this topic, as you're all aware of your budgeting and planning and cash flow issues, but we did want to highlight some challenges that may impact your staff in this regards. One of the big things that we were talking about here is basically, are you projecting your year-end payrolls or are you accruing your liabilities? If we've projected our timesheets in the past, whereas if we've had our final pay, or our first pay in the new year is July 2nd, and we want to make sure that we're posting that as a payable in the old year, we're trying to get people to project what they were going to work up until June 30th. So that'll create its own issues in having to make those corrections if necessary, but you want to just make sure you're aware if you're doing any of those situations where you are projecting your timesheets and how you're handling that. One of the big things is the balloon payments. Are you offering your 10-month employees a chance to annualize their salary, basically calculating their salary over a 12-month period and paying what we call the balloon payment at the end of the fiscal year? This is a good option because it defers almost 17% of the employee's salary to the end of the year. So if you're looking at ways to improve your cash flow and help the employees that want extra pay or want some of their pay deferred over the summertime, let's say, offering that incentive and offering that option to them is a good idea. The cash flow issue is not only just impacting your organization, but also new hires. Do you have a process in place when you have a new hire? Are you making them all go 3 weeks before their first pay? Do you have a process where if you get the paperwork, a couple days before you cut checks, you'll do a partial pay for those new employees? You just want to make sure that you understand that those situations and issues may be coming up and that your payroll person is consistently applying those procedures. And last, how are you budgeting for additional salary or overtime? You have a form in place that will authorize your payroll people to pay additional monies above and beyond their contract amounts. We call it a Job 2 form for any instructional or people that normally work during the school year. If they're working outside their normal job titles, or within their job titles just additional hours, are you allowing them and your payroll staff the authorization to go ahead and pay that, and at what rate they're paying that? So basically, as we're wrapping up the first part of the seminar, we just wanted to make sure that the functions performed within your payroll department are important, and they're due to a time-sensitive nature, that it's helpful in supporting the office for the school business officials to be familiar with these challenges. The seemingly small document, which we've shown in the center of our diagram, the payroll schedule, plays a large role in the function of the payroll office as well as all other departments when working together to successfully process the employees' pay. So this concludes our part one. Brian is going to be talking about looking through your payroll through the auditor's eyes. And again, if you have any questions, hopefully we'll have some time at the end, or we'll try to address them throughout the presentation.
Hi, I'm Brian Dumont, and I'm a partner with Dermody Burke & Brown, and I'm experienced doing both external audits and internal audits, so some would say I'm twice as geeky as your normal auditor. Essentially, Dennis and Trina really took you through the summary of the payroll process. I'm going to take you in another direction from an auditor's perspective. And really what I'm going to do is try to take you into the warped and scary mind of an auditor and help you understand a little bit better what their goals are from both an external auditor's perspective and an internal auditor's perspective. We're also going to take a look at their approach to auditing payroll, both from an external and an internal auditor's perspective. Then we're going to get into everyone's favorite area when it comes to auditing and accounting, and it's fraud. So I've always enjoyed talking about that topic, although you never want it to happen to you. It's always a fascinating area. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is some common findings and best practices that we've seen when we've done our audits. And I would encourage you to share any best practices that you may have. And if there's any areas that your auditors are just beating you senseless on and you'd like some help, maybe I can help you out there as well. So please send those in. Okay, so going to the next slide, we're going to talk about the goals and of the external auditor and the internal auditor. What auditors care about is risk, and what they're looking for is risk of misstatement, risk of error, risk of fraud. Okay, the external auditor cares about it from the financial statement perspective. And what they're looking to do is put an opinion on the financial statements as a whole. So what they do is they design tests, and what they're looking to do is obtain reasonable assurance that the financial statements are free from material misstatement, whether it's caused by error or fraud. Now, in order to design the proper testing, the auditor must understand where the risk is. Okay? They're not designed to detect immaterial error or fraud, so they're looking at the big numbers. And when I say material, what does that mean? Well, when you take a look at the financial statements, it's any error or misstatement that would affect a user's decision when reviewing the financials. So if I made that as clear as mud, that's probably what every auditor will tell you. But they're looking at it from the 1,000-foot level. The internal auditor is taking a look at it a little bit closer. Okay? They're required to perform an annual risk assessment and at least test one area in the control systems. Now, they're concerned about both material and immaterial risk of error and fraud, and they're looking for noncompliance with district policies and procedures. Again, they're looking at a more detailed level, and their end goal is to provide a product which is the risk assessment itself, okay, and they may or may not test payroll. Okay, so next slide we're going to be talking about the external auditor and the internal auditor's approach to auditing payroll. Now, if any of you have been through an external audit or dealt with your internal auditor, you know what they do first. They sit down with you and they have about a pound of checklists that they want to go through with you. And essentially, these checklists are designed to help an auditor identify where the particular controls are in the system and where there's missing controls, okay? So they're going to sit down with payroll, they're going to sit down with the business official, HR, personnel, and really try to gain a solid understanding of how the process works and who's looking at what and where the review procedures are that are in place, okay? They're going to analyze the systems once they have them properly documented, and they're looking for where the controls are missing, and they're looking for something called key controls. Now, what's a key control? A key control is that control that will be effective if every other control goes wrong. And an example of that in the payroll area is if your system can generate a payroll change report, okay? And what would happen is that the payroll change report would show all the changes to a payroll between one period and the next period. So if a business official or someone outside the payroll department was reviewing that on a regular basis, they would detect if something happened between payrolls. And that would be, from an auditor's perspective, a key control, okay? So once all this is done, the system's documented, it's analyzed, all right, then they determine, okay, can we rely on this system if it was effective? And then you're going to do a walkthrough, which they're going to take maybe one or two items and walk through step by step right through the system. As an example, they may take a time sheet, look for the approval, look to see how it flowed from there, how did it get into the payroll system, how did it get paid, step by step by step, okay? Typically, an external auditor then will perform additional testing. An internal auditor may or may not, because they're going to make a recommendation to the audit committee on what the risk is in this particular area. On the next slide, what I've done is I put a typical test that an external auditor would do as part of the payroll testing, and an internal auditor may do. Okay, so what's the typical test look like? Depending on your auditor, depending on the nature of the risk and the processes at your particular district, they may select between 40 and 100 employees, and what they're concerned about primarily is the amount being paid, the contracted rate, the approved rate in the collective bargaining agreement, board authorization, etc. So that's the primary thing. They're looking for that. The other thing they're looking for is, are the hours worked in agreement with approved time records? Okay. The next question we'll be looking for is, are payroll withholdings appropriate based on the amounts authorized by the employee, whether it's on the W-4 or the related state form? They're also looking for the approval of stipends, increases associated with education, coaching, extra classroom, advisors, other. Really, the hours worked to the approved time records and these stipends and other increases is really where most of the errors as auditors that we've found tend to jump out, because there's a lot more of a manual process, or it's something that's not part of the normal payroll system. It's something addition that has to happen. Okay? We're also looking for an amount paid is coded to the correct general ledger expenditure account. And what you're worried about there is a Title I teacher being charged to Title I, or is it going that particular person going through the general fund? We're looking for proper allocation there.
Brian, can I jump in and ask you a question here?
Certainly.
As an auditor, do you concern yourself with payroll code transfers? Does that send up a flag to you if you notice there's transfers occurring, or?
Is this a budget transfer
Yes.
you're talking about?
Yes.
Budget transfers, we're definitely looking to make sure that they're approved. That's
Okay.
the first thing we're looking at. So if we see budget transfers, whether it's between payroll codes or any other codes, automatically a bell's going to go off and saying, okay, is this appropriate? Was it properly approved? And that's where we would take it from there. So yes, it's something we care about, and we would probably look to see was it appropriate and was it approved?
And approved, do you mean a signature by your SBO?
Either that, or sometimes there's a policy in place where over a certain dollar amount it would have to be approved by the superintendent or even the Board of Education.
Right. Okay.
So we would be looking to see what the district's policy was, and then if it was approved in accordance with that policy.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay. And I think the last thing we'd be testing is the Form I-9, the immigration form. We see a lot of those missing as well, but I can't remember the actual date that those had to become. It was sometime, I think, in the 70s. If you were hired in the 70s, anybody after that particular date needs to have the I-9 immigration form in their file. Okay? So that's what the external auditor would be looking at. The internal auditor may be testing that as well. So the test is completed. They've gone through all this. They've bugged the heck out of you. They've gotten all this information from you. Now what are they doing? Well, essentially, they're going to take a look at the results of the test and compare it to the risk that they identified when documenting your system. Were there any problems identified in the test? Okay, for example, if, were all the stipends appropriately approved? Were the salaries recomputed correctly when you compare them to the individual's contract or approved rate? If there was no issues or problems there, chances are the external auditor's got a very good comfort level of how your system's working. They may do some additional tests that we would call analytical procedures, and where you compare maybe current year to prior year, current year to budget, and some of them may even take your quarterly 941 reports and reconcile those back to your books and records. So that's the typical external audit test, all right? If they see any weaknesses in the design of your system, they may write you up for a finding whether or not all these things worked well or not. If they see a flaw in your system that could be internal control weakness, you may get hit on that even if you've done everything, you paid everything right. Because what they're looking for is where an error could occur, not if an error did occur. Okay? So that's our external auditor. The internal auditor is going to advise the audit committee whether an area is high, moderate, or low risk based on their system documentation and based on how they analyze the system in place. Okay? And what they're going to recommend to the audit committee is what they think should be tested based on the risk at the particular district. All right? So what typically you see internal auditors do is they can do that global test I talked about on the previous slide, or they get to something that's a little bit more focused. And what they'd be looking at is maybe an overtime audit, substitutes, taking a look at that, the substitutes compared to the teachers and making sure that a substitute's working for a teacher that's properly off, audit of hourly workers, taking a look at travel and expense reimbursements, and then sick time, vacation time audit. Is that being tracked appropriately in accordance with policy? Okay. Now's where the excitement comes in. Okay, we're going to be talking about fraud risk. Before this webinar, I Googled school district payroll fraud, and I got probably a dozen to 24 hits right off the bat. And so I thought I'd share a few of them with you just because it's kind of interesting what's going on out there. First one is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And this one was done in December 10th, 2009. It says, an affidavit of probable cause says XYZ freeloader here changed the bank account numbers of 10 part-time employees to the account number where her salary is deposited. The affidavit says the fraud was discovered when a substitute teacher wasn't paid for the hours she worked in November. I saw this fraud and I thought, my gosh, how dumb can you be? That one just seems like if you're working part-time, you're going to know that you're not getting your money. So that one I thought was interesting and more amusing than anything. The stupid criminals emails that you see from time to time, that kind of fell in that category. The next one came out of Detroit, and this was May 22nd, 2009. And here a payroll manager and a former painter with the district's maintenance department continued to receive paychecks after he retired and was no longer entitled to receive them. And then the payroll manager was receiving disability checks at the same time, according to the indictment. It's alleged that the fraud involved more than $400,000 paid out between 2001 and 2005. Now, that's a lot of money in a very short period of time to get out of a district. And so, I mean, this stuff is pretty serious. The next one came out of Tampa, and a criminal report affidavit says a secretary at a particular elementary school received nearly $8,000 in unauthorized overtime between July 2006 and December 2007. That's one that you see more and more common. The overtime area, it tends to be an area where I've been involved in a few fraud audits. And lastly, there's one here from Chicago. You can never leave Chicago out when you have a good fraud. 2 Chicago public schools payroll workers have been charged with theft for allegedly creating $137,000 worth of bogus paychecks for other CPS employees, school officials said Friday. A third CPS employee also was charged with theft for allegedly accepting some of the phony checks. And I got one more, and then we'll get into how we can do something about this. Last fall, this is, let's see, where's this from? Seattle. I'm trying to make sure everybody's properly represented here. Last fall, district officials discovered a high school teacher allegedly adding overtime to her signed timesheets, something she'd been doing since 1992, and this is a 2007 article. Of the $179,000 the district believes she stole, $120,000 was in the past 5 years. What you see is that once a person finds they can get away with it a little bit, then they tend to continue to dig in and continue to dig in. So that was really what I found when I did Googling. So then as an auditor, you always want to know the history of what's going on. So back in the 50s, criminologist Donald Cressy interviewed 200 people incarcerated for embezzling, and he did a study that identified the following common factors of embezzlers: that they had a significant personal need, an idea was formulated to fix the need, and the individual may have previously perceived that stealing was dishonest, but because of the situation they were in, they were able to justify it. And that gave birth to the fraud triangle, and that's what you see on this particular slide. Okay? You have the incentive or pressure to create a fraud, all right? The opportunity you see, or perceived opportunity to do it, and then the attitude and rationalization, okay? Now, incentive or pressure, right now, we are in probably one of the times in the last 10 years, it's one of the highest risk times for incentive and pressure. Unemployment now is 9.7%, or at least it was as of March. In 2006, to give you a benchmark, it was 4.61%. All right? So chances are there's spouses out there or family members out there that are unemployed or underemployed, and there may be pressure on employees from a financial perspective at the district. Everyone's retirement accounts took a bath, and now most of them have come back to some degree, although mine really hasn't. And then home values haven't been all that great either. So there's a lot of incentive or pressure out there to commit fraud. Okay? The opportunity there is also there in some degrees. Essentially, some districts aren't able to replace employees because they're trying to save all the money they can in their budget. So as there's less people in the business offices and less people in the payroll area, people are covering more duties. There's less segregation of duties. The work of one isn't necessarily under the review of the work of another. Trina made lots of comments about not being able to take a vacation, okay, that she was going to have to come in, no matter if there was a tidal wave and it wiped out the district, she was going to be there. But the fact is from an auditor's perspective, that's not a good thing, because what you like to have is a backup in place that at least 1 week or one pay period a year, somebody comes in to do a payroll, because that's when typically an error or a fraud would come into play and be identified. Okay, so the opportunity is there as well, and now the attitude and rationalization. Well, with the downsizing, okay, at various districts, or not replacing current employees, and with increased responsibilities, that can really create a sense of entitlement. Well, I'm doing all this extra work, and they're only paying me 2% more than they paid me last year. Darn it all, I deserve a bonus, and I think I know how I'm going to get one. okay? So really the attitude and rationalization could be there. So if I'm attacking fraud from an auditor's perspective and from a district perspective, where I'd be focusing in is on the opportunity, okay? So the incentive and pressure you really can't do too much about. The attitude and rationalization you probably can't do too much about. The opportunity is where, as a district business official, you can really step in, okay? So we're going to go to the next slide here. And really where a business official can step in is through additional monitoring. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the common findings and best practices, okay? But essentially, from an auditor's perspective, what's an auditor going to do in addressing payroll? Okay, well, one thing that we like to use is data extraction software. And what that does is it allows us to take your entire population, all of your employees, and we can probably take a big data dump of your payroll to date, all right, and look for unusual things that we're not expecting to see. For instance, as was discussed earlier, was there special payrolls that were done? Okay, well, we would quickly be able to segregate out any unusual payrolls. We'd also be able to segregate out any unusual amounts that would be paid to particular bargaining units or particular individuals. So that would be something that we'd be looking to do. One of the things that's very common is a payroll check distribution audit. All right, and that's where either district employees or sometimes you invite the auditors in to hand out, everybody has to come in to pick up their paycheck from a central location or maybe from a designated person. And that's very effective in identifying a ghost employee or somebody that shouldn't be on the payroll that is. And that would have addressed one of our fraud articles that I went through, that they had a ghost employee on the books there. Okay? A payroll cash audit is something. Essentially, your payroll cash account, you should have a separate payroll cash account if you can, and you'd be looking for unusual transfers in or out of the payroll account other than the typical ones you'd have on any given payday. You're also looking for weird deposits in transit, something that may not be clearing in the proper amount of time, because typically if you're transferring something in, it's going to be clearing in a day or two. If it doesn't clear, then you might have an issue. So that's what you'd be looking at. New employee audits, that's another area where we'd look at, is we take a look at what the new employees were that were approved by the board, take a look at what's in the payroll, and see what's there. And overtime audits, that's another area that we focus on, and we've done a couple of those recently, and so it's always an interesting challenge. The time cards that were spoke about earlier often aren't very legible, and if there's a concern about whether the overtime was properly approved or actually was proper at all, sometimes it's very difficult to see what was intended to be there. And what I've seen on some time cards that made it difficult is you see it's written there in pen, and then you see that there's been white out, and you see it's been written over, or fives have been changed to sixes, and you don't know especially if you're conducting an audit, what the original number should have been. So really, if you do make a change on something, it might make sense to initial that change right next to the number, so you know who did it and when it was done. Okay? So I guess when we're talking about fraud and it relates to payroll, where we've seen fraud is typically a trusted employee who was so trusted that management relaxed their review, or where management was too busy to review or review thoroughly, because essentially that person then feels like there's a perceived opportunity to commit the fraud. So that's really where the focus would be there, is make sure, and we're going to talk about this more, as a business official, or if you have that responsibility in doing a review, that you take that seriously, because essentially that's where the opportunity goes away. So we're on to common findings and best practices, and once again, I would welcome any best practices that you may see, or any findings that you're challenged with that we might be able to help you out with. But I put some down that we commonly see in our practice. And the first one has to do with segregation of duties, and that usually gives everybody they cringe when they hear that word from an auditor. because a lot of districts are saying, hey, look, you know, there's only one or two of us here, maybe three of us. There's only so much we can do, okay? And essentially that's true. If you have a payroll department and a personnel department or an HR department, the ideal situation is you segregate duties between the two, where the personnel or HR department creates the position, inputs the salaries and the particular rates, and the payroll department is dealing more with the processing, the hours, and the reporting function. Okay, so that's the ideal situation if you can have the two different departments. However, you don't always have that luxury, and when you don't, that's where management and the board come into play. So management's going to have to be taking a look at reports. The payroll change report I'm going to talk about over and over because I really think that's a good report. The caveat to that is that who generates the payroll change report? It's typically you're asking the payroll clerk for the payroll change report. And if that's one of the people that you're worried about, you may want to find out how to run that on your own. Okay. Next item was finding information technology access controls are not sufficient. So what happens in this particular situation is the payroll clerk can get at the general ledger and make adjusting entries, or the account clerk can get at payroll and make changes to payroll. And what you want to have is have maybe viewing rights of each, because one may need to see what the other one has, but you may not want to have one being able to affect the other. Okay, so that's really the concern there. We recommend that you evaluate your system access at least annually, because it's amazing what can happen through software upgrades, changes in personnel. Perhaps there was a change in the regs from state ed or something that now you have to do this or that. So if you take a look at it annually, every time there's a software upgrade or a change in software, and any time processes have changed, our responsibilities have changed, or personnel have changed, because essentially whenever there's a change in business officials, payroll clerks, or whatever it might be, everybody has in their head what they did, and chances are what's in their head isn't necessarily what's in their job description that's written down there. So it's important to try to really gain an understanding of what's being done and how it's being done. The next finding we see is insufficient documentation of approvals. Okay? For an auditor, if they can't see it, it doesn't count. And what I've just put that in there because essentially I'd hate to have any district do all the right things and you do all the right approvals and everything is perfect and you get written up for it. So this is more like a heads up more than anything. But there are certain places where I think it needs to be written. And where it needs to be written is on the time cards. I think that's very important. I think on the payroll change report, it's very important that documentation be there. And the certification of payrolls, the superintendent or the business official typically certifies the payroll. And if it's not there, I would like to see that documentation. Okay. Going on to the next page. Accruals are cut off or not proper. Okay, this is more an external auditor's finding than an internal auditor's finding, but essentially the external auditor wants to make sure that all of the payroll that was for the June 30, 2010 year end is in the June 30, 2010 audit. It doesn't matter if you paid for part of it in July 2010. Okay, so that's something that they really care about, and it keeps them up at night. This is what auditors dream about, is missing something like this. So what should you do? Have the payroll clerk advise that the account clerk or treasurer after year end the wages that are paid for the year and what was paid in the subsequent year. Okay, so good communication there will keep your auditor sleeping well at night, and they won't be as cranky when they come visit you. Okay. The next item is account balance reconciliations not done or done timely. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, your payroll cash accounts need to be reconciled monthly. That's really a critical thing, and sooner rather than later, because what you hate to have happen is have something be identified when doing the bank reconciliation, but you didn't note it till 3 or 4 months later. Okay, that would be a bad thing because it's a very good control that can be very helpful to you. The other thing that I'd like to see happen is that if you're going to have 941s, those Form 941s, be reconciled to your books and records, do it on a quarterly basis rather than at year end. A lot of districts save that reconciliation to the year end, and then when they don't balance right off the bat, they have a year's worth of data they have to go through to find out why it's different. If you do it on a quarterly basis, it makes it a lot easier, and you don't yank out as much of your hair. Okay. Next item is training, travel time off, and expense reimbursements not appropriate or appropriately documented. We've seen that finding from time to time. And this one really auditors love to chime in on, especially internal auditors, because essentially what it is it's a chance to really take a look at the key administrators and say, okay, the superintendent decided that he wanted to go to the seminar that is in Hawaii, all right? And the seminar is on a Tuesday. He flew out there on a Saturday with his whole family, okay? And the seminar is over on Thursday, but he's not coming back until the following Saturday, all right? What was approved, what should be approved, that ought to be dealt with ahead of time. First of all, if they're going to Hawaii with the budgets that we have right now, I would think that maybe the board would have something to say about that, but that's a whole other deal. Essentially, though, there should be a process or procedure in place where the superintendent's, let's say, travel is approved by the board, the business officials is approved by either the board or the superintendent, and there ought to be a pecking order for these type of things. If there is going to be a situation where a family does go or an extra night is going to be stayed there, it ought to be worked out in advance. This is how the district is coming out ahead, or this is why we're doing this. It may be cheaper to fly out on a Saturday rather than a Sunday for a Monday seminar, but that ought to be documented because essentially if your external auditor doesn't pick on it, your internal auditor will, and if your internal auditor doesn't, chances are the state comptroller will. Okay? Going on to single audit compliance, basically what you find here, I talked about this earlier, and I've used the example of Title I employees. Title I employees need to do some type of certification if they're working in Title I and in another area. Okay? So essentially what you're looking for there is the proper certifications in place. You're going to need to work with your special ed fund coordinator, work with your auditors to gain an understanding of what grant requirements are what and what documentation is necessary for compliance. So, the next finding is more of an auditor's pet peeve, but essentially can get your auditor out of your district sooner rather than later. And everyone knows the best side of an auditor is their backside because it means they're leaving. But essentially, disorganized personnel or payroll files. What we've seen in a best case situation there is that there's almost a cover sheet that's stapled to the front of the file that says, here's what's in here. You know, 2008 W-4 is the most current one, okay? And you see this, and this. There's tabs. It's in order. It's an auditor's dream. Now, that's typically not the reality of the situation, but what you don't want to have happen is have 6 different W-4s in there where the 2004 W-4 is in front of the 2008, which is tucked in the back, the 2006 is somewhere in between. So while I don't expect an auditor's dream, if you could have a cover sheet in there that really showed what the contents was, what the auditor might be looking for, that's going to help you justify to the auditor, yep, we're paying this person this particular amount. You should see some education credits in here of this. You should see a W-4 in here that's this. And that's going to help a long way down the road. Some districts are talking about going electronic or paperless here. That's something that's a challenge, I think, because then you take a look at getting all the history in there and keeping it organized, but that's certainly a way that I've heard discussed. The next couple of items are just best practices. I couldn't come up with any findings that related to them per se, but as a business official, you should ask for reconciliation, the payroll change report to perform additional oversight. As I mentioned before when we were talking about fraud, what we're looking to do is mitigate the perceived opportunity. So if somebody knows that you're looking at it, then essentially you're going to deter fraud per se. And if you're looking at it, let's say everybody's perfect at your district, and they probably are. But if you're looking at it and they're under a lot more strain because they may be trying to balance more than they had in the past, you may be able to find errors that may occur. Okay? The next point is just more or less a comment. Fraud deterrence is easier than finding actual fraud, and sometimes the appearance of a review is as good as actual review. So what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, you're a business official. You don't have time to do all this stuff that this crazy auditor is telling you ought to look at, but you're really concerned about fraud in your district, and so what you do is you still ask for all these same reports, okay? Well, and then periodically, maybe every other report, every third report, you ask some very specific questions on those of your employees, okay? Essentially, that's really, I think, a critical thing because the perception of review is there, even if you maybe don't have time to do it, okay? And taking a look at another best practice you have is take a look to your bank. Your banks have tons of good controls that they have there. My favorite one is the callback email feature with wire transfers. Okay, essentially, to me, that is critical because a lot of money can go real quick in a wire transfer. So if you have that in place, that's a good thing. Positive pay on checks is another, but look to your bank there on your payroll cash account and all your cash accounts. Okay. Reevaluate internal controls when changes in personnel systems and requirements. Again, the payroll side, you have your payroll clerk is new. Even if your superintendent's new, they may not be reviewing the payroll certification in the same manner as the former superintendent. So it's important to look at that. Now it's time for two crazy ideas. First one, instead of doing a payroll check handout, why not do a W-2 handout? Okay, so many people are on direct deposit now. So you're going to do a payroll check handout to look for a ghost employee? Go ahead. I'm not going to come in because guess what? My money's in my account anyway. So too bad for you. A W-2, they may be more apt to come in. Now you have no right, as far as I can tell, to withhold the W-2, but certainly if you do have a W-2 handout, that may encourage people to come in that might not because they have direct deposit. And crazy idea number 2 is recompute salaries on a test basis. Okay, essentially, most of what we have in our systems are when the person was hired, they're put into the system. And guess what? Next year you add 3%. The year after that you add 2%. The year after that you add 3%. Whatever the contract says. After about 7 or 8 years, what if there was an error made in year 2 or year 3? That error is going to perpetuate itself forever. Okay? Now, am I asking you to take a 30-year employee or 25-year employee and go back to the starting date and roll it forward? No, I wouldn't do that. But what I would do is maybe make it a practice that you take a look at 5-year employees or something like that, and periodically just have someone run 9 or 10 or 10 or 11. See if you have any issues. Maybe you pick a couple out of, one out of this particular bargaining unit 1 year, one out of this the next year, and see what happens. Because essentially, if there are errors, you want to know that and deal with that. Okay. So from an auditor's perspective, payroll can be a real challenge. At the same time, I think there's really some good opportunities in this economy to down errors, irregularities, and to put some good, solid controls in place. So thank you very much for your attention. That's all I had. Is there any best practices out there that anyone had that they'd like to share?
We do have a question that came in that we kind of ignored for a little bit. Let's go back and see if I can find it. Astrid's asked about, can you address the good and the bad of allowing employees to update their own 403B deductions online with our third-party administrator? For them it is Omni. And does the district need hard copy of the signatures?
I will, if you want, I'll handle that.
Absolutely.
We actually use Omni as well, and I know that they've gone online with their SRA applications. So what the good is, the employees can fill that out at any point in time, submit it electronically, change their 403B deduction, basically from the home computers or whatever, and that allows them an ease of access to do that. The bad thing is you lose your control over that function a little bit. We used to collect the salary reduction agreements, fax them over to Omni, fill in our information first, and then you get the authorization. But the nice thing is you can put in your Omni file with them that you want a copy of that, and they know that it hasn't gone to you yet because I think it's Part 2 that has to be filled out by the employer, or the Section 2 there. So if that's blank, they know that you haven't seen that salary reduction agreement yet, and they will or should be faxing you a copy of that signed agreement. So I would say overall it's good because you can put that control in place to be able to get a copy from Omni Group. Also, you will be getting a authorization through an email to start a deduction, and you can match that up against any copies or faxes you've received from Omni to make sure if you have gotten it or haven't gotten it already. So, and you can always follow up with them to make sure that you get a copy of that new salary reduction agreement. We do require that we have them online with us, copies, so that if an employee ever comes to us or we're ever challenged to allowing that or authorizing that deduction, we've got that salary reduction agreement in hand.
And just to springboard off that, the last question was, does district need hard copy of signatures? And I don't think you need hard copy of signatures if you have a situation in the way that Dennis described it.
I had posted that anybody could feel free to contact me at thapgood@ocmboses.org. I just wanted to clarify that that's going to be Trina's email and not Dennis's email.
And my email is in the slides, so please feel free to send me any questions that you might have as well. Okay. If there's no further questions, I guess we would turn it back to New York State ASBO.
All right, thank you very much. We do have the ability to have a Q&A session with the presenters, voice to voice. If anyone's interested in that, we can certainly go ahead and do that. If you are interested, please press 7# on your phone. I will wait here just about 60 seconds to see if any of you are interested in doing so. But beyond that, if you don't have any questions, we're done for the day. And New York ASBO appreciates you all coming. Okay, thank you much.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.